Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed held his breath for 3 minutes and 47 seconds in the flooded torpedo room of USS Sailfish while every instinct in his body screamed to surface, to breathe, to live. But if he surfaced now, if he failed to complete the underwater weld that no regulation permitted and no sane man would attempt, 23 submarines would remain crippled in Pearl Harbor while the Japanese Navy controlled the Pacific, and the war would be lost before it truly began. His lungs burned like he'd swallowed fire, his vision narrowed to a tunnel of darkness punctuated by the blue-white arc of the welding torch held at arm's length, and through the murky water he could see Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen watching through the observation porthole, her face pressed against the glass, her hand flat against it like she could somehow will him oxygen through steel and seawater. Marcus had told her this repair procedure was impossible, that regulations required dry dock and 50 days of systematic disassembly, that what he was proposing, flooding compartments intentionally, working underwater with jury-rigged equipment, completing in days what should take weeks, was not just dangerous but suicidal. She'd looked at him with eyes that had already buried too many sailors and said 6 words that would haunt him forever. Then I guess you'd better not die. The Pacific War was 11 days old, and Pearl Harbor looked like God had given up on America. Marcus stood on the dock at Submarine Base Pearl Harbor on December 18, 1941, surveying damage that made his chest physically ache. 23 submarines, nearly half the Pacific Fleet's undersea capability, sat in various states of disrepair, victims not of Japanese bombs but of something worse, systemic mechanical failures that peacetime maintenance schedules had masked but wartime operational tempo had exposed catastrophically. The torpedo tubes were failing. All of them. Different boats, different symptoms, but the same root cause, a design flaw in the loading mechanism that no one had noticed because in peacetime, submarines fired maybe 1 live torpedo every 6 months for testing. But in combat? The boats were firing full spreads, reloading under pressure, pushing systems beyond their design specifications, and the mechanisms were cracking, warping, jamming. 50 days per boat minimum, said Captain Raymond Holbrook, the submarine base commander, standing beside Marcus on the dock. He was 58, had survived the initial attack by being ashore with food poisoning, and looked like he'd aged a decade in the past week. That's what the Naval Repair Facility says. Dry dock, full disassembly, replacement of compromised components, reassembly, testing. 50 days minimum, maybe 70 for the worst cases. Marcus did the mathematics in his head. 23 boats. 50 days each. They couldn't dry dock simultaneously. The base had 4 dry docks total, 3 of which were still being used for surface vessel repairs from the December 7th attack. So even working at maximum capacity, they were looking at 2 years, Marcus said quietly. Minimum. More likely 3 to get all these boats operational again. And in 3 years, the Japanese will control every island between here and the Philippines, maybe the entire Pacific coast. Holbrook's voice was flat. We need these submarines operational. The surface fleet's crippled, our carriers are the only thing keeping the Japanese from invading, and submarines are our only offensive capability right now. Every day these boats sit in harbor is another day the Japanese Navy operates with impunity. Sir, what if there's another way? Holbrook turned to look at him, this 32-year-old chief petty officer who'd spent 12 years working on submarines, who'd forgotten more about boat repair than most engineers ever learned. I'm listening. The damage is primarily in the torpedo tube loading mechanisms. Specifically, the hydraulic ram assemblies that push torpedoes from magazine to tube. The failures are stress fractures in the mounting brackets, the rams are fine, but the brackets are cracking under combat loading cycles. I know that, Reed. That's why they need dry dock repair. You can't access the mounting brackets without flooding the torpedo room, and you can't work on submarines with flooded compartments without dry docking first. That's regulations. That's safety. That's how it works. Marcus had been expecting this. Had been rehearsing his pitch for 3 days, ever since he'd realized what was possible and how insane it would sound. Sir, what if we flood the compartments intentionally? Do the repairs underwater, inside the boats, without dry docking? The silence that followed was so complete Marcus could hear waves lapping against the dock half a football field away. You're proposing working inside flooded submarine compartments? Holbrook said slowly. Underwater. With welding equipment. Yes, sir. That violates approximately 17 different safety regulations, 3 separate Navy procedures, and probably the laws of physics. Yes, sir. It's also completely insane. Yes, sir. But it's fast. I can do the repair work in 5 days instead of 50. We set up a rotation. I train a team, we hit the boats one after another. All 23 operational in under 6 months instead of 3 years. Holbrook studied him with eyes that had sent men to war and watched them not come back. Why you? Why not the engineers at the repair facility? Because they follow regulations, sir. And regulations say this is impossible. But I've been working on boats since I was 20 years old. I know every inch of these systems. I know what's actually necessary versus what's procedure. And I know, Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. I know that sometimes you have to break the rules to save lives. Or you break the rules and get yourself killed. That's a risk I'm willing to take, sir. Holbrook was quiet for a long moment, staring at the 23 damaged submarines, at the war that was already being lost, at the impossible choice between following regulations that would take 3 years or embracing madness that might work in 6 months. You have 3 days, Holbrook finally said. Proof of concept on 1 boat. If you can successfully repair USS Sailfish's torpedo tubes in 5 days or less, using your suicidal underwater procedure, I'll authorize it for the rest of the fleet. If you fail, I won't fail, sir. If you fail, you'll be court-martialed for violating Navy safety regulations. And if you die trying, I'll make sure they list cause of death as stupidity rather than heroism. Understood? Understood, sir. Marcus assembled his team that afternoon. He needed diverse men who could hold their breath, work underwater, stay calm in confined spaces while their lungs screamed for air. He needed welders, experts who could work with jury-rigged equipment, could see through masks and murky water, could complete precise work under impossible conditions. And he needed someone who understood submarine systems well enough to know when he was about to do something fatally stupid. That last person turned out to be Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chin. She found Marcus in the submarine tender workshop at 1800 hours, where he was modifying welding equipment for underwater use, a process that involved a lot of waterproof sealing, electrical insulation that probably wouldn't hold, and prayers to whatever deity protected idiots with welding torches. Chief Reed, she said, and her voice had the particular tone of an officer about to tell you your brilliant idea is actually a suicide mission. I heard about your proposal to Captain Holbrook. Yes, ma'am. Marcus didn't look up from his work. Sarah Chen had a reputation, MIT engineering degree, youngest female submarine officer in the Pacific Fleet, brilliant mind combined with a tendency to point out exactly why your plan wouldn't work and what would kill you first. I think it's the most idiotic thing I've heard in 12 years of naval service. Noted, ma'am. It violates every safety protocol. The electrical systems alone, one mistake and you're electrocuted underwater. The pressure differentials could rupture your eardrums. The limited visibility could cause you to damage the exact systems you're trying to repair. The toxic fumes from underwater welding in a confined space could knock you unconscious before you even know you're in trouble. She paused. Also, I want to help. Marcus finally looked up. Mum. I said I want to help. I think it's idiotic, but I also think it's the only chance we have to get these boats operational in time to matter. So if you're going to do this suicidal repair routine, you're going to do it with proper engineering oversight. Consider me assigned to your team. Captain Holbrook approved that? Captain Holbrook doesn't know yet. I'm excellent at not asking permission when I already know the answer will be no. Sarah pulled up a stool, sat down, and studied his modified welding equipment with a critical eye. This electrical insulation won't hold underwater for more than 10 minutes. I was hoping for 15. Hope is not an engineering principle. We'll need triple redundancy on the ceiling, and you'll need to ground the entire system through the hull. Also, you're going to need a backup air supply in the torpedo room, because I've run the numbers and there's no way you can complete the welds on a single breath. I can hold my breath for almost 4 minutes. The welds will take 6. Minimum. So unless you've suddenly developed gills, we need an air supply. She started sketching on a piece of paper, her engineering mind already solving problems Marcus hadn't even identified yet. We'll rig an emergency air line from the surface, seal it through the torpedo loading hatch, give you something to breathe if you need it. You'll still be working underwater, but at least you won't drown. That's optimistic. That's pragmatic. I don't deal in optimism, Chief. I deal in mathematics and what's physically possible. And what you're proposing. It's barely possible. But barely is better than what we've got now. They worked through the night. Marcus and Sarah, joined by 3 divers Marcus had recruited, Thompson, Rodriguez, and a kid named Miller who was 19 and claimed he could hold his breath for 5 minutes, which Marcus didn't believe until Miller proved it. They modified equipment, planned procedures, ran through simulations of what Marcus would need to do inside the flooded torpedo room of USS Sailfish. The critical repairs are the mounting brackets, Sarah explained, pointing to technical drawings of the torpedo loading system. 6 brackets per tube, 4 tubes, 24 brackets total. Each bracket has stress fractures here and here. She indicated points on the diagram. You'll need to reinforce with welded support plates. Each weld takes approximately 45 seconds if you're working in air with good visibility. Underwater, in limited visibility, with modified equipment? Triple that. So figure 2 minutes per weld, 24 welds, that's 48 minutes of underwater welding work. That's impossible, Thompson said flatly. He was 35, had been diving since he was 12, and knew the limits of human capability. Nobody can work underwater for 48 minutes straight. Your muscles would cramp, your core temperature would drop, you'd lose fine motor control. That's why we'll break it into phases, Marcus said. Flood the torpedo room, dive in, complete what I can in 1 breath cycle, maybe 3 or 4 welds. Surface, recover, repeat. Multiple dives over multiple days until all the welds are complete. And the boat stays flooded the whole time? Miller asked. We can't keep flooding and draining, it'd take too long, waste too much time. So yes, the torpedo room stays flooded until the repairs are complete. We seal the compartment, pump it full of seawater, and I work in there like a fish for 5 days. Rodriguez whistled low. This is insane. Yes, Marcus agreed. But it's fast insane. And fast is what we need. Day 1 of the Sailfish repair began at 0600 hours on December 21st. Marcus stood on the deck of the submarine, looking at the forward torpedo loading hatch, knowing that in 30 minutes he'd be diving through that hatch into a compartment deliberately flooded with seawater, attempting repairs that regulations said were impossible. Captain Holbrook was there to observe. So were 3 officers from the Naval Repair Facility, there to document exactly how Marcus was going to kill himself so they could learn from his mistakes. And Sarah Chen was there, her face carefully neutral but her eyes betraying worry she'd never admit aloud. Final checks, Sarah said, running through her clipboard. Emergency air line rigged and tested. Underwater lighting installed. Welding equipment ready. Backup team ready to extract you if things go wrong. Medical personnel standing by. She looked at Marcus. Are you sure about this? No, Marcus said honestly. But I'm doing it anyway. They flooded the torpedo room slowly, watching pressure gauges, making sure seals held, ensuring the rest of the boat remained isolated and dry. It took 40 minutes to completely flood the compartment, 40 minutes where Marcus stood on deck and rehearsed the procedure in his mind, visualizing every weld, every movement, every second he'd spend underwater. Then Sarah gave him the thumbs up. The torpedo room was flooded. It was time. Marcus pulled on his diving mask, checked his equipment one final time, and dove through the loading hatch into waters so dark and murky it felt like diving into oblivion. The underwater lights helped. Industrial floods Sarah had rigged at strategic points, but visibility was still maybe 10 feet on a good day, less when sediment churned up from his movements. He found the first mounting bracket by feel as much as sight, running his hands along the torpedo tube assembly until he located the stress fracture Sarah had marked on her diagrams. It was worse than expected. The crack had propagated further, weakening the entire assembly. This needed to be fixed yesterday. Marcus positioned his modified welding torch, said a prayer to the patron saint of stupid ideas, and struck the arc. The blue-white flash was blinding underwater, reflecting off particles and creating a sphere of light that disoriented more than it illuminated. But Marcus focused on the work, on the bead of molten metal forming along the crack line, on the support plate he was welding into position. 45 seconds. 1 weld complete. 23 to go. His lungs were already starting to burn, not critically yet, but with the warning signs that meant he had maybe 2 more minutes before he'd need air. Marcus moved to the second bracket, positioned the torch, struck the arc again. 90 seconds. 2 welds. The third weld was trickier, the angle was bad, the visibility was worse, and Marcus's lungs were screaming now, his vision starting to narrow, his body demanding oxygen with increasing urgency. But he'd come this far, and 1 more weld meant 1 more bracket secured, meant the job was 1 step closer to complete. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. 3 welds. Marcus pushed off from the torpedo tube, kicked toward the loading hatch, his lungs burning, his vision tunneling, his mind focused on the single imperative: surface, breathe, live. He broke through the hatch into air and gasped, sucking in oxygen like a drowning man, which he essentially was. 3 welds, he said when he could speak again. Need 10 minutes recovery, then back down. Your lips are blue, Sarah said. And you're shaking. I'm fine. You're hypothermic and oxygen deprived. You're taking 20 minutes recovery, not 10. And you're drinking this. She handed him hot coffee that tasted like battery acid but warmed him from the inside out. Marcus dove 7 more times that first day. Each time, he completed 3 or 4 welds before his body demanded air, before his muscles cramped from cold and exertion, before the work became dangerous instead of merely suicidal. By 1800 hours, he'd completed 18 of the 24 necessary welds, and he felt like he'd been beaten with hammers. Day 1 results, Sarah announced to the assembled officers. 18 welds completed, 75% of repair work done. No injuries, no equipment failures, no catastrophic mistakes. At this pace, Chief Reed will complete all repairs by end of day 2, well ahead of the 5-day estimate. Captain Holbrook nodded slowly. How's the quality? Are these repairs going to hold under combat conditions? I'll need to inspect them properly once we drain the compartment, but initial assessment is excellent. Reed's work is precise despite the impossible conditions. These welds will hold. Then continue. But Reed, Holbrook fixed Marcus with a hard stare. If at any point this becomes too dangerous, we abort. I'm not losing personnel to push a deadline. Clear? Clear, sir. But Marcus knew he wouldn't abort. Couldn't abort. Because 23 boats needed this repair, and if he didn't prove it could be done quickly, they'd revert to the 50-day drydock procedure, and the war would be lost while submarines sat in harbor waiting for repairs. Day 2 started at 0600 with Marcus's muscles screaming before he even entered the water. Cold, exhaustion, and the physiological stress of repeated breath-hold diving had taken their toll. But 6 welds remained, and 6 welds was less than 3 dives if he pushed himself. He completed the first 3 on his first dive, working faster now, his muscle memory adapting to the underwater welding procedure. The second dive got him 2 more welds, but his hands were shaking badly by the time he surfaced, and Sarah insisted on a 30-minute break. 1 more, Marcus said during the break, drinking more terrible coffee. 1 more dive, 1 more weld, and Sailfish is operational again. You can barely hold the torch, Sarah pointed out. Your fine motor control is shot. Come back tomorrow, do the last weld when you're rested. Tomorrow some Japanese submarine might sink an American cargo ship while we're sitting here with 23 boats in harbor. 1 more dive. Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, wanted to order him to rest, wanted to be the responsible engineer who followed safety protocols. But she also understood urgency, understood that every hour counted, understood that sometimes you had to push past safe into necessary. 1 more dive, she agreed. But I'm watching through the observation porthole. And if anything looks wrong, I'm pulling you out whether you're finished or not. Marcus dove for the final time into the murky darkness of the flooded torpedo room, found the last mounting bracket, positioned his torch. This was it. The final weld that would prove the concept, that would demonstrate submarines could be repaired in days instead of months, that would change how the Navy approached underwater maintenance forever. He struck the arc, started the weld, and immediately knew something was wrong. The torch was sputtering. Water had breached the electrical ceiling, was causing intermittent shorts, was making the arc unstable. Marcus should have surfaced, should have aborted, should have taken Sarah's advice and come back tomorrow with properly maintained equipment. Instead, he adjusted his grip, compensated for the torch's instability, and kept welding. Because this was the last weld and he was already down here, and surfacing now meant another dive later, and he was so tired he wasn't sure he had another dive left in him. The weld took twice as long as it should have, 90 seconds instead of 45, and Marcus's lungs were past burning into a cold, distant agony that felt like his chest was being crushed. His vision had narrowed to a pinpoint, just the torch and the weld and the desperate need to finish before his body shut down entirely. Finally, the weld was complete. Marcus released the torch, let it dangle on its safety line, and kicked toward the surface with the last strength he had left. His legs felt like concrete. His arms wouldn't respond properly. The loading hatch was right there, right above him, but it felt 1,000 miles away. Then hands grabbed him, Thompson and Rodriguez, diving in without orders when they saw Marcus wasn't surfacing fast enough. They hauled him through the hatch into air and daylight, and Marcus gasped and coughed and vomited seawater onto the deck while Sarah stood over him looking equal parts furious and relieved. 24 welds, Marcus managed between coughs. Complete. You nearly died, Sarah said flatly. That last dive, you were underwater for 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Do you understand how close you came to not making it back? But I did make it back. And the repairs are done. They drained the torpedo room that afternoon, and Sarah personally inspected every weld Marcus had completed. She spent 3 hours examining the work from every angle, testing structural integrity, checking for flaws or weaknesses or any indication that the rushed, underwater repairs wouldn't hold under combat stress. Finally, she emerged from the torpedo room and found Marcus sitting on the dock, wrapped in blankets, still shaking from exhaustion and cold. The welds are perfect, Sarah said quietly. Not good. Not acceptable. Perfect. You did in 2 days what the repair facility said would take 50, and you did it better than they would have. This changes everything, Reed. Captain Holbrook authorized the procedure fleet-wide that evening. 23 submarines, the same repair routine Marcus had just demonstrated, multiple teams working simultaneously. Marcus would train the other divers, supervise the repairs, ensure quality control. It would take 6 months total, 6 months instead of 3 years. The work was brutal. Marcus and his team hit boat after boat, flooding torpedo rooms, completing underwater repairs, moving to the next vessel while previous ones were tested and declared operational. They refined the procedure, improved the equipment, developed safety protocols that made the work slightly less suicidal. And slowly, incrementally, the submarine fleet returned to operational status. USS Sailfish departed Pearl Harbor on January 2, 1942, fully repaired and ready for patrol. 3 more boats followed by the end of January. 10 boats by the end of February. Marcus barely noticed the passage of time. He dove and welded, surfaced and recovered, trained new teams and supervised repairs. His body adapted to the punishment. His breath-hold capacity increased, his cold tolerance improved, his underwater welding became almost unconsciously precise. But there were costs. Thompson developed chronic ear problems from repeated pressure changes. Rodriguez had to be hospitalized with hypothermia after a particularly long dive. Miller, the 19-year-old kid who could hold his breath for 5 minutes, drowned in April when his airline failed during a repair dive on USS Grayling. They buried Miller at sea with full honors, and Marcus stood on the dock afterward feeling the weight of command, of decisions that traded lives for operational capability, of the calculation that Miller's death was tragic but acceptable because 18 boats were now operational that wouldn't have been otherwise. It's not your fault, Sarah said, finding Marcus alone that evening. I trained him. I sent him down. I designed the procedure that killed him. You designed a procedure that's returned 20 submarines to combat capability in 6 months instead of 3 years. That saved hundreds of sailors who would have died if Japanese submarines kept operating unchallenged. Miller's death is tragic, but the alternative was worse. Does that math make it easier? Marcus asked bitterly. One death now to prevent hundreds later? No. But it makes it necessary. Sarah sat beside him, and for the first time since Marcus had known her, she looked tired. Actually tired, not just physically exhausted but weary in her soul. I hate the mathematics of war. Hate that we measure success in lives saved versus lives lost, that we trade casualties like currency, that we make decisions where someone always dies and we just try to minimize how many. But someone has to do that math, Reed. Someone has to make those decisions. And I'd rather it be people like you and me, people who feel the weight of it, than people who don't. The 23rd and final submarine, USS Seawolf, completed repairs on June 15, 1942. 6 months almost to the day from when Marcus had first proposed his suicidal repair routine. The entire Pacific submarine fleet was operational again, returned to combat capability years ahead of schedule. Captain Holbrook held a ceremony on the dock. Not a celebration exactly, because Miller was dead and Thompson was partially deaf and Rodriguez still had nightmares about being trapped underwater. But an acknowledgement. A recognition that something impossible had been accomplished through combination of desperation, innovation, and personnel willing to risk everything. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, Holbrook announced to the assembled personnel, reported to me 6 months ago with a proposal that violated regulations, defied common sense, and sounded like suicide. He proposed flooding submarine torpedo rooms intentionally and completing repairs underwater that regulations required dry dock to accomplish. He claimed he could reduce repair time from 50 days to 5. Every expert told him it was impossible. Every regulation said it was forbidden. Every safety protocol said it was lethal. Holbrook paused, looking at Marcus with expression that mixed respect and exasperation. And then he did it anyway. 23 submarines returned to operational status in 6 months instead of 3 years. Hundreds of thousands of man-hours saved. Millions of dollars saved. But more importantly, combat capability restored when it mattered most. The Japanese Navy no longer operates with impunity in the Pacific. Our submarines are hunting their supply lines, sinking their cargo ships, turning the tide of the war. He pinned a medal to Marcus's chest, the Navy Cross, for extraordinary heroism in combat. Which was technically incorrect because Marcus had never been in combat, had spent the entire war in Pearl Harbor diving into flooded submarine compartments. But Holbrook had argued, successfully, that Marcus's actions had direct combat impact and met the spirit of the award if not the letter. Thank you, sir, Marcus said, because that's what you said when the captain pinned medals to your chest, even when you didn't feel like a hero. When you felt like someone who'd traded Miller's life for operational submarines and would carry that trade for the rest of his life. After the ceremony, Sarah found Marcus sitting alone near the water, watching submarines that he'd repaired preparing to depart on patrol. What are you going to do now? She asked. Same thing I've been doing. Train more teams. Refine the procedures. The war's not over. Submarines will keep getting damaged, will keep needing repairs. The work continues. The Navy's creating a new position. Underwater Repair Specialist. They want you to design training programs, develop equipment, establish procedures for repairs that regulations say are impossible but necessity demands. Basically, they want to institutionalize your suicidal repair routine. Marcus smiled slightly. From court-martial threat to institutional procedure in 6 months. That might be a record. You changed how the Navy approaches underwater maintenance. Every submarine repair manual is being rewritten based on your procedures. You've literally created a new field of naval engineering. Sarah paused. I'm being assigned to the program too. Assistant Director of Underwater Repair Operations. They want an engineer who understands both the theory and the practice. Congratulations, Mom. It's Sarah. After 6 months of watching you nearly die underwater repeatedly, I think we can drop the formality. She sat beside him, both of them watching the Pacific stretch toward the horizon. You know what I realized? About why your suicidal repair routine worked. Because I'm too stubborn to admit when something's impossible? Because you understood that regulations exist to prevent disasters, but sometimes following regulations guarantees disaster. You looked at 50-day repair schedules and saw the disaster of submarines sitting idle while the war was being lost. So you broke the regulations to prevent the greater catastrophe. That sounds like rationalization for violating safety protocols. It sounds like leadership, knowing when the rules serve their purpose and when they don't, and having the courage to make that distinction. Sarah stood, dusted off her uniform. The first training class starts next month. 40 personnel, learning underwater repair procedures. Try not to kill too many of them. I'll do my best. The training program lasted 8 weeks. Marcus taught diving techniques, welding procedures, safety protocols that made the work merely dangerous instead of suicidal. He emphasized the mathematics of breath-hold diving, the physics of underwater pressure, the engineering principles of what repairs could be done submerged versus what required dry conditions. But more than technical skills, he taught judgment. Taught his students to recognize when pushing forward was necessary and when it was just stupid. Taught them that regulations existed for good reasons but needed to be balanced against operational necessity. Taught them that sometimes the bravest thing was admitting you needed to surface, needed to rest, needed to live to work another day. By 1943, underwater repair teams were standard across the Pacific Fleet. By 1944, similar programs existed in the Atlantic. By war's end, Marcus's suicidal repair routine had become standard operating procedure, taught to every submarine maintenance crew, institutionalized in regulations that previously forbid it. Marcus continued the work through the end of the war. Trained hundreds of repair personnel, supervised thousands of underwater repairs, refined procedures that saved countless man-hours and returned submarines to combat capability faster than anyone had thought possible. And he remembered Miller, kept the kid's photograph in his wallet, looked at it before every training class, remembered that innovation had costs and those costs were measured in lives, not just efficiency metrics. The war ended in August 1945. Marcus was 46 years old, had spent 4 years diving into flooded submarines, had permanent hearing loss from pressure changes and chronic arthritis from cold water exposure and nightmares where he was trapped underwater unable to surface. But he'd also fundamentally changed naval maintenance procedures. Had proven that impossible was just another word for nobody's tried yet. Had demonstrated that sometimes breaking regulations was the most responsible thing you could do. Sarah Chen found him on the dock at Pearl Harbor on VJ Day, both of them watching fireworks celebrate the end of the war, the end of dying, the end of calculations that traded lives for strategic advantage. "What now?" Sarah asked. "The Navy wants you to stay on. Director of Underwater Maintenance Programs. You'd oversee all submarine repair operations, worldwide." That sounds like an office job. It is an office job. No more diving, no more underwater welding, no more risking your life in flooded compartments. Just planning and oversight and making sure the next generation does it right. Marcus was quiet, watching fireworks paint the sky in colors that looked like the welding arc he'd stared at for 4 years, that blue-white flash that meant he was fixing something, making something better, keeping sailors alive through the work of his hands. "I think I'd like that," Marcus said finally. "Teaching others instead of doing it myself. Making sure they understand not just the how but the why. Making sure they remember that every regulation they break, every risk they take, it's not about efficiency metrics or completing tasks. It's about bringing people home alive." "You brought 23 submarines back to operational status," Sarah said. "Probably saved hundreds of sailors by getting those boats back in the fight. That's a hell of a legacy, Reed." "I also got Miller killed." "Yes, you did." Sarah didn't offer false comfort, didn't minimize the cost. "And you'll carry that for the rest of your life. But you'll also carry the knowledge that you did what was necessary when nobody else would. That you looked at an impossible problem and solved it anyway. That you changed how the Navy thinks about what's possible." They stood in comfortable silence, these two people who'd spent 4 years pushing past regulations into innovation, who'd proven that sometimes the stupidest sounding idea was exactly what the situation required, who'd transformed suicidal repair routines into standard operating procedure through combination of engineering and stubbornness and personnel willing to risk everything. To Miller, Marcus said quietly, raising his coffee cup, and to everyone else who paid the cost of innovation. To Miller, Sarah echoed. May we always remember the price of progress. The fireworks continued, celebrating victory, celebrating survival, celebrating the end of war and the beginning of peace. But Marcus and Sarah knew that the work continued, that submarines would still need maintenance, that impossible problems would still need solving, that the next crisis would demand the next innovation from the next person willing to break regulations and risk everything to do what was necessary. That was the real legacy of the suicidal repair routine. Not the 5-day fix instead of 50 days. Not the 23 submarines returned to combat capability. But the proof that sometimes the most important thing was knowing when to follow rules and when to break them, when to accept limitations and when to prove they didn't exist, when to stay safe and when to dive into flooded compartments because someone had to and you were the one capable of doing it. Marcus Reed retired from the Navy in 1956 after 36 years of service. His underwater repair procedures had been used on thousands of vessels, had saved millions of man-hours, had fundamentally changed how maritime maintenance was conducted worldwide. The techniques he'd developed during those desperate 6 months in 1941-42 were still being taught, refined, expanded into fields he'd never imagined. But what Marcus was most proud of wasn't the innovations or the efficiency improvements or the combat capability he'd restored. It was the training programs, the generations of repair personnel who understood that technical skill had to be balanced with judgment, that breaking regulations required accepting responsibility for the consequences, that the goal wasn't just completing repairs but bringing everyone home alive. Sarah Chin stayed in the Navy, eventually becoming the first female admiral to oversee submarine operations. She credited Marcus's training programs with creating the culture that allowed her ascent, a culture that valued innovation over tradition, results over regulation, competence over conformity. They stayed in touch for the rest of their lives, these two people who'd looked at 50-day repair schedules and said, "That's not fast enough," who'd flooded submarine compartments intentionally when regulations forbid it, who'd proven that sometimes suicidal was the most rational approach to impossible problems. Marcus died in 1987, at age 78, of complications related to the physical toll of 4 years diving into flooded submarines. Sarah spoke at his funeral, addressing an audience that included 3 generations of underwater repair specialists, all of them trained using procedures Marcus had developed. Marcus Reed taught us that impossible is just another engineering problem, Sarah said. That regulations exist to prevent disasters, but sometimes following regulations guarantees disaster. That the bravest thing is often knowing when to break the rules and accepting responsibility for what happens next. She held up a photograph, Marcus at 32, standing on the deck of USS Sailfish, soaking wet and exhausted but smiling because he'd just completed 24 impossible welds and proven the concept that would change submarine maintenance forever. This is how I'll remember him. Not as the innovator who developed underwater repair procedures, though he was that. Not as the leader who trained thousands of personnel, though he did that too. But as the man willing to dive into flooded compartments because someone had to, willing to risk everything because the alternative was unacceptable, willing to break regulations because following them meant losing the war. Sarah paused, her voice thick with emotion she rarely showed. Marcus carried the weight of every decision he made. Carried Miller's death for 45 years. Carried the knowledge that his innovations saved lives but also cost them. That's the burden of leadership, knowing that your choices have consequences and choosing anyway, because not choosing is also a choice and often the worst one. After the funeral, a young Navy diver approached Sarah. He couldn't have been more than 25, with the earnest intensity of someone early in their career, still believing the work they did mattered in ways that would echo forward through time. "Admiral Chen," he said, standing at attention. "I wanted you to know, I'm alive because of Chief Reed's procedures. Last year, our submarines suffered torpedo tube damage during exercises. We used his underwater repair protocols, completed the fix in 6 days instead of returning to dry dock. 2 weeks later, We were on patrol when a fire broke out on a civilian cargo vessel. We surfaced, rescued 18 crew members who would have died if we'd been in dry dock instead of operational. Sarah felt something catch in her throat. What's your name, sailor? Petty Officer Second Class David Miller, Mem. No relation to the Miller who died during the original repairs. But I read about him in the training materials. Read about how Chief Reed carried that loss for the rest of his life, used it to make the procedures safer for everyone who came after. He would have appreciated knowing his work saved you, Sarah said. And through you, saved 18 civilians. That's exactly the kind of ripple effect he hoped for. One innovation, one procedure, echoing forward through decades, saving lives in ways he could never predict or measure. Miller saluted and walked away, and Sarah stood in the cemetery thinking about the mathematics of legacy, about how one man's desperate innovation in 1941 had created procedures still saving lives in 1987, about how the costs and benefits of Marcus's choices would continue calculating themselves long after everyone who knew him was gone. The underwater repair procedures continued to evolve. By the 1990s, improved diving equipment and remote-operated vehicles made the work safer, less dependent on human endurance and breath-holding capacity. By the 2000s, much of what Marcus had done manually was being done by robots and automated systems. But the fundamental principle remained that sometimes you had to break conventional thinking to solve unconventional problems, that regulations were guidelines, not absolute laws, that the goal was mission success balanced against acceptable risk. In 2011, 70 years after Marcus's first dive into USS Sailfish's flooded torpedo room, the Navy held a ceremony at Pearl Harbor commemorating the underwater repair program's origins. Veterans, current personnel, and engineering students gathered to honor the man who'd looked at 50-day repair schedules and said, "I can do it in 5." Sarah Chin attended. She was 92 years old, walked with a cane, but her mind remained sharp as the day she'd told Marcus his plan was idiotic and then helped him do it anyway. They'd erected a memorial, a bronze statue of a diver entering a submarine hatch, torch in hand, captured in that moment of commitment when you dive into darkness because the mission demands it. The plaque read, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, Pioneer of Underwater Submarine Repair, 1909 to 1987. Impossible is just another engineering problem. Sarah stood before the statue, remembering a 32-year-old chief petty officer with crazy ideas and the courage to attempt them, remembering 4 years of watching him dive into flooded compartments while she held her breath topside, remembering Miller's death and Marcus's guilt and the slow, painful progress toward procedures that worked. A journalist approached her after the ceremony, young woman with recording equipment and questions about history she'd only read about in books. Admiral Chin, you were there from the beginning. You helped develop Chief Reed's underwater repair procedures. What do you think was his greatest contribution to naval engineering? Sarah thought about that question for a long moment, looking at the bronze statue, at Pearl Harbor's calm waters, at the submarines still being maintained using principles Marcus had pioneered 70 years ago. Marcus's greatest contribution wasn't a procedure or innovation, Sarah finally said. It was demonstrating that the most important skill in engineering isn't mathematical ability or technical knowledge. It's judgment. Knowing when established procedures serve their purpose and when they don't. Knowing when to follow regulations and when breaking them is the more responsible choice. Knowing that every decision has costs and being willing to pay them when the alternative is worse. But Chief Reed's underwater repair routine was dangerous. Personnel died. How do you balance innovation against safety? You don't balance them. You accept that sometimes there is no balance, only trade-offs. Marcus could have followed regulations, required dry dock repairs, and kept everyone perfectly safe while submarines sat idle for 3 years. Instead, he broke regulations, developed dangerous procedures, and got boats operational in 6 months. One approach prioritized safety. The other prioritized mission success. Marcus chose mission success and spent the rest of his life making the procedures safer so future personnel wouldn't have to make the same trade-offs he did. Do you think he made the right choice? Sarah looked at the journalist, this young woman who'd never had to make decisions where someone died regardless of what you chose, who'd never carried the weight of command that meant your calculations were measured in lives. I think he made the necessary choice. Whether it was right, that's a question that doesn't have a clean answer. But it was necessary. And sometimes that's all we can do, make the necessary choice and spend whatever time we have left trying to make it more right than it was. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for Miller and the other personnel who died during the development and implementation of underwater repair procedures. Sarah stood with head bowed, remembering faces, names, the specific ways each person had contributed to innovations that outlived them. After the silence, a Navy diver descended into Pearl Harbor's waters beside the memorial, carrying a wreath that would be placed on the harbor floor in honor of all the underwater repair personnel who'd served since 1941. Sarah watched the diver disappear beneath the surface, watched the bubbles mark their progress, and thought about Marcus making that same descent 70 years ago, diving into darkness with improvised equipment and desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this suicidal plan would actually work. It had worked. Against every regulation, every expert opinion, every probability calculation, it had worked. Not perfectly. Not without cost. But it had worked, and that made all the difference. That evening, Sarah returned to the dock where she'd spent so many days in 1941 to 42, watching Marcus dive, monitoring his air time, ready to pull him out if things went wrong. The dock looked different now, modern facilities, improved equipment, submarines that bore only passing resemblance to the boats they'd repaired during the war. But the water was the same. Dark, murky, hiding depth and danger and possibility in equal measure. Sarah stood at the edge, looking down into that darkness, and remembered Marcus surfacing after that final weld on Sailfish, blue-lipped and shaking but triumphant. Remembered Miller's funeral, Marcus standing silent and devastated. Remembered training classes where Marcus taught students not just how to weld underwater but how to think about risk and responsibility and the weight of decisions that determined who lived and who died. "You did good, Reed," Sarah said to the water, to the memory, to the ghost of a friendship that had been forged in impossible circumstances and endured until death separated them. "You changed everything. And you never let yourself forget what it cost." That balance, between innovation and responsibility, between success and sacrifice, that's what made you great. Not the procedures. You. The sun set over Pearl Harbor, painting the water in colors that reminded Sarah of welding arcs, of that blue-white flash that meant someone was fixing something, making it better, keeping the mission alive through skill and courage and willingness to attempt what everyone else said was impossible. Sarah Chin died 3 years later, in 2014, at age 95. Her obituary mentioned her barrier-breaking career, her innovations in submarine engineering, her role as the Navy's first female admiral overseeing submarine operations. But what the journalists didn't mention, what made it into only the private remembrances of those who'd known her, she'd been the engineer who'd made Marcus Reed's suicidal repair routine actually work, who'd turned desperate improvisation into procedures that would save lives for generations. At her funeral, they played a recording from an interview she'd given shortly before her death, when someone had asked her about her greatest professional accomplishment. "I helped prove that impossible was just another engineering problem," Sarah's recorded voice said. "I stood beside Marcus Reed when everyone said underwater submarine repairs couldn't be done, and I helped him do it anyway. Not because we were brave or brilliant, but because we looked at the alternative, 3 years of submarines sitting idle while the war was being lost, and decided that anything was better than that. Even procedures everyone called suicidal." The recording paused, and you could hear Sarah's breathing, the weight of 95 years and 7 decades of carrying the memory of what they'd accomplished and what it had cost. "People ask if I'd do it again, knowing what I know now. Knowing Miller would die. Knowing the physical toll on Marcus. Knowing all the costs we didn't anticipate when we started. And my answer is yes. Because the alternative, losing the war, losing the Pacific, losing everything, that would have cost so much more. We made the necessary choice. Not the right choice, maybe. Not the safe choice, certainly. But the necessary one. And sometimes that's the only choice there is." The torch passed to new generations. The underwater repair procedures continued to evolve, continued to save time and resources, continued to prove that Marcus Reed's fundamental insight, that some repairs could be done submerged if you were willing to accept the risks, remained valid decades after his death. In 2041, 100 years after Marcus's first dive into sailfish, the Navy held a centennial celebration of underwater submarine repair programs. By this point, the procedures had been refined to the point where what Marcus did would be considered impossibly dangerous by modern standards. Improved equipment, better safety protocols, autonomous systems, all had made underwater repairs routine rather than suicidal. But the ceremony honored the pioneers who'd developed the procedures when they were suicidal, who'd broken regulations because following them was even more dangerous, who'd paid the costs of innovation so future generations wouldn't have to. The keynote speaker was Rear Admiral Jennifer Miller, David Miller's granddaughter, direct descendant of the petty officer whose life had been saved by Marcus's procedures in 1986, representative of the countless people who existed because submarines had been repaired quickly instead of slowly, because mission capability had been prioritized over perfect safety, because someone 70 years ago had been willing to attempt the impossible. "We stand on the shoulders of giants," Admiral Miller said to the assembled crowd. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chin, and yes, Petty Officer First Class Miller, my great-grandfather's namesake, who died during those early repairs and whose sacrifice Marcus Reed never forgot, never minimized, never allowed to be just a statistic in the cost of progress. She gestured to the memorial statue, now weathered by 70 years of Pacific salt air but still capturing that moment of commitment, that instant when someone chooses to dive into darkness because the mission demands it. These people, Reed, Chin, Miller, and everyone who worked on those first repairs, they proved something fundamental about human capability. They proved that when someone tells you something's impossible, what they usually mean is, nobody's figured out how yet. They proved that regulations exist to serve missions, not the other way around. They proved that the most important question isn't, is this safe? But, is the alternative worse? Admiral Miller paused, looking out at the audience. Naval personnel, engineers, historians, descendants of the people who'd pioneered underwater repairs a century ago. The procedures we use today are nothing like what Chief Reed developed in 1941. We have better equipment, better training, better safety protocols. But we still use his fundamental principle, that sometimes you have to break conventional thinking to solve unconventional problems. That principle has shaped submarine maintenance for a century. It's shaped how we approach every impossible problem, every crisis that seems insurmountable, every situation where following regulations guarantees failure. So when we honor Marcus Reed today, we're not honoring a procedure or a technique. We're honoring a way of thinking, a willingness to attempt what everyone says can't be done, a courage to accept responsibility for the consequences of innovation, a commitment to making the necessary choice even when it's not the right choice or the safe choice. The ceremony concluded with a dive, a modern Navy diver, using equipment Marcus couldn't have imagined, descending into Pearl Harbor to place a memorial wreath exactly where Marcus had made his first underwater repair dive a century before. The symbolism was clear. The work continues, the mission endures, and every generation must have their Marcus Reed, their Sarah Chin, their people willing to dive into darkness because someone has to. That evening, long after the ceremony ended, an elderly man sat alone by the memorial statue. He was 93 years old, had served in submarine maintenance for 40 years, and had been one of the last people trained directly by Marcus Reed before the chief's retirement in 1956. His name was Thomas Rodriguez, son of the Rodriguez who developed hypothermia during the original sailfish repairs, grandson of immigrants who'd come to America seeking opportunity, inheritor of a tradition that valued innovation over conformity. Thomas touched the bronze statue gently, remembering a younger Marcus Reed, older by then but still diving when necessary, still teaching by example, still carrying the weight of Miller's death and the responsibility of decisions that had shaped history. "We did good, Chief," Thomas said quietly. "The procedures you developed, they're still saving lives. Still making the impossible routine. Still proving that sometimes the craziest idea is exactly what the situation needs." He pulled out a photograph, old and worn, Marcus Reed and Sarah Chin in 1945, standing on a dock at Pearl Harbor, surrounded by the 23 submarines they'd returned to operational status. Both smiling, both exhausted, both carrying the knowledge of what they'd accomplished and what it had cost. The kids today don't understand, Thomas continued. They use the procedures, they follow the protocols, but they don't understand that every safety regulation they follow exists because you broke different regulations first. They don't understand that innovation always has costs, that progress is measured in lives as much as efficiency, that someone had to be first, and being first meant accepting risks that would be unthinkable today. Thomas stood, his knees protesting the movement, feeling every one of his 93 years. But some of us remember. Some of us carry your lessons forward, teach the next generation not just the how but the why. Teach them that the most important skill isn't technical ability but judgment, knowing when to follow rules and when breaking them is the more responsible choice. He saluted the statue, this old man honoring the memory of a mentor who'd shaped his understanding of what it meant to serve, to innovate, to make the necessary choice and carry the weight of it forever. The Pacific stretched toward the horizon, dark water hiding depths and possibilities in equal measure. And somewhere in that darkness, metaphorically if not literally, Marcus Reed's ghost smiled and dove deeper, forever completing one more impossible repair, forever proving that suicidal could be survivable if you were skilled enough and lucky enough and willing to pay the cost. The story doesn't end. Stories like this never really end. They echo forward through generations, through people who carry the lessons learned at terrible cost, through innovations that become routine and then tradition and then forgotten history that needs to be remembered and retaught to each new generation. But on this night in 2041, 100 years after a desperate chief petty officer had proposed flooding submarine compartments and completing impossible repairs underwater, the story reached a kind of completion. The procedures had been proven, refined, institutionalized. The pioneers had been honored, remembered, commemorated in bronze and ceremony and the living tradition of personnel who still used the principles Marcus Reed had established. And perhaps that was the real legacy, not the 5-day repairs instead of 50 days, not the 23 submarines returned to service, not even the lives saved through faster turnaround times. But the proof that impossible was just another engineering problem, that regulations served missions rather than the reverse, that the most important thing was knowing when to follow rules and when to break them and having the courage to accept responsibility for that choice. That was Marcus Reed's gift to the Navy, to engineering, to everyone who faced impossible problems and needed permission to attempt impossible solutions. He demonstrated through his life and his work that sometimes suicidal was the most rational approach, that sometimes breaking every regulation was the most responsible action, that sometimes the necessary choice was the only choice even when it wasn't the right one or the safe one. And that lesson, learned in flooded submarine compartments in 1941, refined through 4 years of war and 4 decades of peacetime innovation, carried forward through the testimony of those who knew him and the procedures that outlived him, that lesson endured. Because every generation needs their Marcus Reed. Their person willing to look at 50-day repair schedules and say, I can do it in 5. Their innovator who breaks regulations because following them guarantees disaster. Their leader who accepts the burden of decisions that cost lives to save more lives, who carries that weight forever because that's what responsibility means. The torch passes. The work continues. And somewhere, in every flooded compartment where someone attempts a repair everyone said was impossible, in every moment when someone chooses necessary over safe, in every decision that breaks regulations to serve missions, in all those moments, Marcus Reed's legacy lives on. Not in bronze statues or memorial plaques or ceremony speeches, but in the simple act of diving into darkness because someone has to, because the mission demands it, because the alternative is worse. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what it meant to develop a suicidal repair routine that fixed submarines in 5 days instead of 50, not the efficiency metrics or the technical innovations, but the proof that impossible was conquerable if you were willing to pay the price and carry the weight of what that conquest cost. Marcus Reed paid that price, carried that weight, and in doing so, gave permission to everyone who came after to do the same when their turn came, when their impossible problem needed their suicidal solution, when their necessary choice demanded their courage. The work continues. The torch passes. And the lesson endures. Sometimes you have to dive into flooded compartments. Sometimes you have to break regulations. Sometimes you have to make the necessary choice even when it costs everything. And sometimes, if you're very skilled and very lucky and very willing to accept the consequences, that suicidal repair routine becomes the procedure that saves the world.